Yeah, g'day YouTubers. Tinker O'Toole again here with another video. Today we're going to talk about the 10 degrees downward tilt on a tiltable vise, which is this type here, that tilts. For a right hand tooth, we push that away from us, and for a left hand tooth, you pull that towards you. This is used for 10 degrees downward tilt. So this is one type of grinder from Taconic, a Jolly Star. Then we've got a Jolly Evo, and that also has a slidable vise. They both work different. They both change the geometry different, but it gives the same effect. And to illustrate that effect, we will use a file, because that's the way that it used to be done before grinders came along. So if we look at a tooth and we look at the top plate here, and we place our file sitting parallel and horizontal with the tooth, if we drop it down 10 degrees, we expose the back of the tooth. By exposing the back of the tooth like that, it means that the file's going to come in more in contact with the front before eventually it grinds a bit off and then it becomes parallel again. By this time, you would have changed the angle of the top plate and lost 2.5 degrees. Now, this type of grinder, the Jolly Star, can compensate for that loss of 2.5 degrees if you desire that. And you might ask, why would I desire to offset it 2.5 degrees? We'll just put a slide up on the top plate cutting angle. That's straight out of the manual, and that can show you maybe in a little bit more detail of the setting. So while that's being displayed, we can talk. Okay, so you've got all different manufacturers out there: Oregon, Still, Carlton, and so on and so on. Some of them recommend 10 degrees downward tilt, some of them don't. Now, I did say before that using the tiltable vise, you'll lose 2.5 degrees. So therefore, you can compensate for that. Where would you want to use the compensation? Well, let's just say you thought that you may have looked at your tooth and think it's got too much hook or it doesn't have enough hook. So you could compensate for an additional 2.5 degrees. So by using this setup here with the offset, you'll set it at 62.5 degrees. You'll set this at 32.5 degrees, and you'll end up with 60 degrees, and you'll end up with 30. It'll compensate. You'll lose 2.5 degrees because what you're actually doing is tilting the vise, and the tooth is going from a horizontal position to be leaning on an angle away from the grinding wheel, and that changes the geometry. So we'll just put another slide up now that actually shows the top plate angle, and it shows it with the additional 2.5 degrees set on the top plate. So it's entirely up to you whether you use that feature or not. It's built into this grinder. It's there to use. And with tiltable vices, you end up with a little bit more discrepancy, and we can sort of like zoom in and sort of show you that. So what we'll do is set the grinder up. It may be a little bit difficult to see because 2.5 degrees isn't a lot. Sometimes you can see it with your eye, and other times you can't see it. It just depends on how good your eye is to attention to detail. So we'll set it up in the standard mode without any tilt, and we'll have a look how the grinding wheel comes in contact with the tooth. So there's the tooth set up with no tilt. I ground this tooth or chain yesterday, and it's 30 degrees on the top plate. And when we bring the grinding wheel down, you can see that it's nice and parallel. However, if I put 10 degrees downward tilt on it, and that's just a matter of loosening the chain and moving it that way, there will be a difference the way that the grinding wheel comes in contact with it. Now, what I need to do is adjust this an additional 2.5 degrees, right? So I need to put this on 2.5 degrees extra, which is, let me just get this right. Right about there. And when I bring the grinding wheel down, it is very difficult to see, but you may be able to see it in that. The back of the grinding wheel seems to be in more contact with the back of the tooth than the front of the tooth. If I put it back in the normal position, right, so if I just put it down like that and turn, can you see how that's different now? So what they're saying, that when you tilt the tooth, the tilt goes from being horizontal, flat, to being on an angle like that. And when you actually pull the grinding wheel down, it'll change the geometry and grind it slightly different. And that's why you've got the offset on here. So if we put that slide back up again, you'll notice the difference on the setting from not using tilt to using tilt. I think they put it on 37.5 degrees just to illustrate. I don't know anyone that ever uses 35 degrees. I don't. I only ever use 30, but nonetheless, you could use 35 degrees in pine. But I'm in Australia and we only have really hardwood, so it's not being used. Now, the question can come up, what advantage of using this or not using this? That's entirely up to you, and it depends on the manufacturer of the chain, whether they recommend 10 degrees downward tilt. And I always say to everybody, there's nothing wrong with trying it, and if you believe that it works better, use it. If you believe that it doesn't work better, don't use it. We'll have a look at the movable vices. So if you want to use a tiltable vise, the disadvantage is, like the file, that when you drop the file down, you'll lose 2.5 degrees. And this is what happens on a tiltable vise, that you'll lose 2.5 degrees. Is it noticeable? Well, I guess the answer is yes, but is it noticeable to you? That would depend. It's not a game changer. All it is giving you the option whether you want to retain a 30-degree angle still on here if you use 10 degrees downward tilt, or do you care that it drops back to 27.5 degrees? I doubt whether you'll notice any difference. It's just up to you whether you want to do that or not. It's built with the grinder to use or not to use. And I guess that's the thing with the Jolly Star. It's got a lot of features on it. Now, the other thing to remember, that these tiltable type vices came along before the slidable vices, mainly on the Oregon range. Typical, the Steel USG had a slidable vise going back to the late 60s, early 70s. So the slidable vise has been around a lot longer, and we'll have a look at the slidable vise and talk about the advantages and disadvantages. So just to briefly recap, the only disadvantage of using 10 degrees downward tilt on a tiltable vise is that you lose 2.5 degrees. You can compensate for that quite easily by giving an additional 2.5 degrees on the top plate cutting angle, which is the angle that's on the back, and an additional 2.5 degrees on the top plate here. It's up to you whether you want to use that feature or not. If you don't have that feature on a cheaper grinder and you want to use that feature, just add 2.5 degrees on your top plate cutting angle and 2.5 degrees there. It's just that this is set up for that. So easy to see visually. So yeah, you've got a visual reference point here, and you've got a visual reference point here with the little notches on there. Okay, so we looked at the tiltable vise. Now we've got the Jolly Evo that has a slidable vise, and we can talk about the pros and cons after we've reviewed this. and I can give you my opinion which one I like the best and for what reason. So again, it depends on whether you're going to use the 10 degrees downward tilt or not. But in this situation, there is no offset on the top plate cutting angle, and there's no offset on the top plate. So what actually happens with a slidable vise that we don't tilt the tooth? Whereas before, when we're on the Jolly Star, the tooth is sitting horizontal, and then when we tilt the vise, it tilts down around 10 degrees tilt. We tilt the vise down like that. And by tilting the vise down at an angle, it means that it lines up on the grinding wheel in a slightly different position, and that changes the geometry. So with the sliding vise, we move the teeth outwards from the wheel. So in this situation, this is an outside tooth, we will move the vise this way. For an inside tooth, we will move the vise 10 degrees that side. So what we will do, and look, you're not really going to notice this difference, that we're going to zoom in here and we're going to bring the grinding wheel down in the position that's standard, no tilt, and you can see that it comes parallel with the tooth. Perfect, right? So what we'll do next is adjust the vise, and we'll slide it 10 degrees this way, which is right about there. I just knocked that vise a little bit, so I'll make sure that's back on 30. Right, there it is. And when we bring this down, you really don't notice anything, except all as you did was pull the vise an additional 10 millimeters. You can see slightly, I can just see slightly that the wheel comes in a little bit more contact at the back of the tooth, right? So that's just interesting, that when you look at that, it comes slightly more in contact with the back. And if we move that back again, we'll just demonstrate that. We'll move that back again. And this is also, can you see that the wheel is almost fairly uniform in the way that it comes in contact with the tooth at 0 degrees. That's at 0 degrees. The moment that we pull it forward 10 degrees, the wheel is more in contact with the back of the tooth. It will have a slight effect on the geometry, but nowhere have I seen a grinder with a slidable vise that's set up with an additional 2.5 degree offset. There's no offset, there's nothing in the manual about it, but you can see a slight difference, a very, very slight difference. So I do believe that if we set that at 30 degrees, we may lose a little bit off that. Now where that black line is, we're going to grind, and I suspect that it's going to grind a little bit here. So we're going to lose some degrees on that angle. So it'll be interesting whether we lose 2.5 degrees, and in that case there's no offset for it. Not on this grinder. So let's have a look at it. You see the black line? Definitely touching the back. Look at that. We've definitely lost a little bit off that. We go in a little bit closer. You can see that there's more of the line on the front than the back. So for those people sometimes to say, oh, it doesn't make any difference. Yes, it does make a difference. Definitely makes a difference. So you can see that it makes a difference on a tiltable vise, and it definitely makes a difference on a slidable vise. It may be only a small difference, but nonetheless it makes a difference. I haven't measured it. I can measure it and see how much I think it's going to be. It may not be 2.5 degrees. It may only be somewhere between 1.5 and 2, but you could see that it touched the back of the tooth first, having 10 degrees downward tilt. So it did change the angle. It does work different than a file, and it does work a little bit different than the tiltable vise, but it achieves the same goal in the end. So we'll just have a look at that and see if the angle changed. Okay, so there's the difference. You can just see it. It's not a lot. So you probably find there's a degree or two that it has changed. So yeah, definitely there is a difference. Okay, so what I want to illustrate now is that if we actually have a look, I'll put a bit of tape on there. We're on the center line right now, and if I move the vise, we're on a right hand tooth, and if I move it out towards me, we're going to be more than 10 millimeters off. So you can see that we're grinding on the upside of the wheel. We're no longer grinding on the center line. And it's the same thing if you move it. If we swap tooth to that size tooth, left hand tooth, and we go to our 10 degree tilt, again we're off the center line by about 12 millimeters. So therefore, offset grinding will mean that as the wheel gets smaller, it won't have a huge effect because you're a fairly long distance away from the center line. So 10 degrees downward tilt will definitely help with that, meaning that you're going to grind the left and the right side evenly. You've got a little bit of leeway, whereas if you don't use 10 degrees downward tilt, you eventually will be grinding one side a slightly different geometry than the other side. So 10 degrees downward tilt to me is good to use from that perspective, that you offset at least 10 millimeters from the center line, which will give you a much better grinding position for both the left and the right teeth, so that you're grinding symmetrical, even degrees on the top plate angle, the top plate cutting angle, everything's even, because you're approximately 10 millimeters from the center line on the left and the right. Whereas if you grind without 10 degrees downward tilt, you're on the center line, but as the grinding wheel wears down, you're going to find out that the grinding wheel will change more on the left side of the tooth, because as the grinding wheel comes down on an arc, it'll have to go down lower as the grinding wheel wears down, and because it's going to come down lower, it's going to be different on the left side and the right side. And that's why it's a great idea that if we can keep the grinding wheel in the middle, and that's where a movable vise can compensate for that much better than a tiltable vise. Look, I hope that information helps. It's just giving a perspective on a tiltable vise and the perspective on a slidable vise. As I said, the only thing that I mentioned before, that it's more time consuming setting this up. One grinder that has the advantage over all of this is a steel USG grinder. Because of the way that it's designed and all the offsets that are built into it, you don't have to worry about 10 degrees downward tilt. Everything is built into that grinder. The only other grinder that's very versatile than this Taconic, which is the Jolly Evo and the Jolly Star, would be the Oregon 5 20. It's got a slidable vise built into it, and it's also got a tiltable vise built into it, and I think it's hydraulic assist as well. So yeah, that is a different type of machine, and if you're in the market for a machine, hopefully that information can help you. Now, the only other thing lastly that I would say is that, okay, the 10 degrees downward tilt can be beneficial for some chains and not make any difference for other chains. But that said, is not a game changer. It may help only a couple of percentage in performance between 10 degrees tilt and no tilt. If anything, probably one of the biggest advantages of using 10 degrees downward tilt is that it grinds the left and the right tooth uniform rather than not having tilt, because of the way that 10 degrees downward tilt moves off the center line by at least 10 millimeters. That's probably the biggest advantage of all. You're not going to feel that in your cutting performance. It's not going to affect your cutting performance. It's just going to make sure that everything is balanced a little bit more. Oregon, highly recommend 10 degrees downward tilt. Still don't recommend it, although I definitely know it's built into the RS chain, and still just don't talk about 10 degrees downward tilt. For the last 30 years, they discontinued recommending, even though it's built into their chain from brand new, and even though it's built into their chain on the Stihl USG grinder. One of the reasons I don't think Stihl talks about the 10 degree downward tilt, especially with a file, is people tend to hold the file much more than 10 degrees and stuff everything up. And I think that's the reason they don't talk about it. Anyway, I hope the information helps. Please subscribe to the channel, and comments are welcome. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.